Establishing central control early, this pawn advance immediately dictates the flow of the game and opens diagonal lines. Developing the knight towards the center immediately contests white's central grip and prepares for further piece activity. Securing central space, white immediately challenges the knight and prepares to control key squares. Solidifying the center, this prepares to develop the bishop and create a robust pawn structure against white's aggressive intentions. Developing the knight establishes central influence and prepares for kingside castling, reinforcing white's solid opening. Challenging the center's d4 pawn now initiates a fascinating Queen's Indian setup with potential for both sharp tactical skirmishes and subtle positional maneuvering. Solidifying the center, this develops a piece, prepares for queenside expansion, and contests crucial central squares, potentially leading to a queen's gambit declined structure. Challenging the center's control directly, this thrust injects immediate dynamism, forcing a decision on white's pawn structure. Establishing central pawn control with quiet development, preparing for bishop activity and potential king safety. Instantly contesting the center, this knight's development solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling. Preparing to expand on the queen side and restrict black's potential for piece development like bb4, white aims to control key squares and secure a safe haven for their queenside pieces. Securing the b5 square with this pawn thrust is a strategic commitment, potentially hindering your queenside development and offering white a subtle outpost for their pieces. While it prevents an immediate knight invasion, it also limits your pawn chain's flexibility and might lead to a slightly cramped position if white can effectively exploit the queenside. Consider how this impacts your plans for activating your bishop on c8. Liberating the center by capturing the pawn immediately creates a dynamic pawn structure where white aims to leverage the open d-file for piece activity and potentially launch an attack, though this might come at the cost of some positional cohesion and could invite counterplay if not handled carefully. Reclaiming the pawn is a logical priority, immediately repositioning the bishop to a square that eyes the kingside and influences the central squares, preparing for a potential fight for the d-file. Challenging the pawn structure, this advance aggressively claims more central space and aims to destabilize black's bishop on c5 by forcing it to retreat or be captured, potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Reclaiming the important diagonal for the bishop, a7, stabilizes the queenside pressure while preparing for future development or perhaps a quiet regrouping. Safeguarding the bishop from immediate pawn pressure and preparing to activate it along the long diagonal, this development gracefully repositions a key piece, aiming to pressure black's queenside structure while contributing to white's growing central influence and solidifying the queenside pawn majority. Securing the monarch amidst the arising central skirmish demonstrates astute king safety, a crucial priority when the pawn structures begin to lock and the queenside play intensifies. The rook now assumes its post on the semi-open c-file, poised to exert pressure and support future pawn advances, aiming to restrict black's queenside mobility. Black has just surrendered the central pawn and accepted a somewhat cramped position, prioritizing freeing the bishop on a7 over maintaining central influence. This decision might lead to a strategically passive pawn structure for black if white can effectively consolidate and exploit the open lines. Clearing the central ranks initiates an endgame phase, shifting the focus from active piece play to the subtle nuances of pawn structures and minor piece activity. Relinquishing the central file after white's queen sacrifice signals black's acceptance of a more closed, positional struggle, where piece coordination becomes paramount. Unleashing the bishop to its most aggressive diagonal, this maneuver immediately eyes the weakened queenside pawns and prepares to exert pressure along the a2-g8 diagonal, seeking to capitalize on black's slightly awkward placement of the rook on d8. Black aims to reroute the bishop to a more active square, potentially challenging white's control of the d-file and preparing to develop the queen's knight. Securing the monarch is the immediate priority, bringing the king to safety behind a wall of pawns and pieces, a crucial step in preparing for the middle game skirmishes or potential endgame maneuvers. This placement of the rook on the open c-file signifies a bold assertion of black's presence, immediately contesting the file that white's own rook now occupies. It's a direct challenge for control, setting the stage for a potential endgame where rook activity on open files often proves decisive, and it begins to coordinate black's pieces in anticipation of future pawn breaks or tactical skirmishes. Securing the bishop on e2 fortifies white's queenside pawn structure, preparing to contest the c-file with potential rook maneuvers while simultaneously adding another defender to the central squares. Centralizing the bishop to e8 aims to reinforce the d-pawn and potentially prepare for a queenside expansion, or simply find a more active square for this piece, which was previously passive on d7, blocking the c-file rook. Establishing a powerful presence on the d-file, the rook aims to exploit black's potentially exposed king. Initiating the rook exchange on this open file offers a stark simplification, a strategic shift towards an endgame where pawn structure and piece activity will become paramount, potentially benefiting the side that can more efficiently activate its remaining pieces. Clearing the central file with this rook exchange now consolidates control and prepares for a potential pawn push on the queenside, or a repositioning of the remaining rook to support the king should black attempt any immediate threats. Relocating the monarch to the center of the board here, *kf8*, offers immediate protection from any potential pawn storms or knight forays aiming for the king's initial position on g8, while simultaneously preparing for a smoother transition into the endgame by connecting the rooks more effectively should they eventually find active squares. Shifting the monarch towards the kingside now opens up lines for the rooks and prepares for potential pawn advances, a subtle repositioning that enhances the king's safety and anticipates the endgame. The king bravely ventures towards the center, signaling a desire to participate more actively in the unfolding position and perhaps preparing for potential pawn pushes in the future. Sharpening the attack, the bishop slides to a central square, eyeing the pawn structure and preparing for potential breakthroughs while reinforcing the knight's influence over the critical d5 square and setting the stage for a more dynamic battle in the center. Securing the kingside pawn structure, 18. h6 prevents immediate kingside expansion by white's pieces, particularly the knight on f3, which might eventually ig5. This subtle prophylactic measure also creates a small escape square for the king on h7 should central play become too intense. Initiating a king march to centralize and escape the queenside pressure signals white's intention to activate their monarch, preparing for potential pawn advances or reinforcing the center as the game simplifies. Retreating the bishop to b8 is a subtle but crucial repositioning, aiming to eye the now open c-file and potentially support a future e5 pawn push, while simultaneously clearing the path for the rook on c8 to become more active. Instigating a knight fork attempt, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create tactical opportunities on the queenside, hinting at a subtle shift towards endgame considerations by simplifying exchanges and opening lines. Releasing the knight from its passive placement on f6, black decisively exchanges a piece that was somewhat hemmed in, aiming to simplify the position and potentially activate the remaining pieces more harmoniously. This maneuver also aims to disrupt white's piece coordination, particularly the bishop on d3. Liberating the bishop from its pawn guard, white immediately reclaims central influence and aims to exploit the now open diagonal for the prelate, creating a dynamic interplay of forces where the black king's sanctuary might become a future point of pressure. A pivotal moment arrives as black fortifies the pawn chain, subtly preparing to challenge white's bishop pair and seeking breathing room for the king's escape route. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside begins here, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create an escape square for the king on g2 should the need arise. Solidifying the pawn structure, h5 immediately arrests white's potential kingside pawn storm and creates a vital outpost for the bishop on g6. This defensive measure not only prevents aggressive pawn advances, but also subtly encourages white to commit their pieces forward, potentially creating weaknesses that can be exploited later. Launching a knight to d2 signifies white's intention to reroute this piece, likely towards the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. The knight's current position on e4, while active, was somewhat exposed after the exchanges. This maneuver prepares a more potent deployment, possibly to f3 or g4, increasing pressure on the black monarch's defenses. Notice how white is slowly building positional pressure, a hallmark of sound strategic play. Navigating the knight towards the queenside opens up possibilities for pawn breaks on that flank or a repositioning to the critical central squares, a welcome injection of activity after a series of rather passive exchanges. Consolidating the bishop's influence onto the queenside diagonal, this repositioning aims to free up the central pawns and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously avoiding the knight's potential harassment. The knight embarks on an intriguing journey, abandoning the relative safety of the center to potentially target the queenside or even find refuge on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's planned pawn storm initiated by the h-pawn. Unleashing the f-pawn injects immediate dynamism, potentially cracking open the kingside and targeting black's somewhat passive piece placement. This aggressive thrust aims to destabilize black's pawn structure while simultaneously creating attacking avenues for white's rooks and bishop, forcing a reactive stance. By advancing the f-pawn, white subtly probes for weaknesses around the black king, disrupting any comfortable defensive setup and initiating a positional battle for initiative. The pawn's forward march begins a complex dance of maneuvering, seeking to exploit the slight space advantage and create tactical imbalances. This audacious advance signals a shift in white's strategy, from building up to actively disrupting black's coordination and seeking an immediate advantage. The knight repositions to a more central and active square, eyeing potential outposts on c4 or e4 while bolstering the pawn chain's defense. Gambiting the pawn structure for a potentially open g-file, white initiates a daring offensive aiming to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement and king safety. A bold pawn thrust aims to dislodge white's knight from its secure outpost and potentially open lines for black's pieces. Gaining space on the kingside, white prepares to launch a pawn storm that could dislodge black's knight from its seemingly secure outpost. Shifting the bishop to a7 prepares for a potential advance on the queenside, eyeing open lines and the squares it influences. Exchanging the bishop for a knight here abandons white's most active minor piece, which was contributing significantly to the pressure on the c-file and defending important squares. While it simplifies, it concedes the bishop pair's advantage and allows black's knight to reposition more freely, potentially targeting weaknesses on the kingside. This creates a less dynamic, more passive pawn structure for white, and the resulting pawn majority on the kingside might prove difficult to activate given the lack of open lines. The initiative quietly shifts towards black, who can now explore opportunities to exploit the slightly weakened pawn chain on the kingside. Embracing the doubled pawns on the kingside, black accepts the positional concession to immediately open the e-file for the rook, aiming for active counterplay against white's somewhat exposed king. 29. RC1 aims to finally secure the crucial c-file, exerting pressure and preparing for potential breakthroughs as the game transitions into a more positional struggle. The bishop's sudden advance to b5, forcing a check, immediately disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn chain and threatens to dismantle black's cramped position. This aggressive foray by the bishop, often a more passive piece in these closed structures, now opens up lines of attack and creates immediate tactical complications, demanding a precise defensive response from white to avoid further positional concessions. Securing the king's position becomes paramount as the game streamlines towards its endgame, and this immediate repositioning aims to shield it from any potential threats lurking on the open files. Exchanging the rooks here on the c-file fundamentally alters the game's character, ushering in a rookless middle game where maneuvering and pawn structure will dominate the strategic landscape. Finally, a decisive recapture solidifies control of the central files and opens avenues for pawn advancement. Heralding an active endgame, the monarch ventures forth, initiating a crucial pawn advance that will define the ensuing struggle on the central files. Reasserting influence on the central light squares, This bishop repositioning prepares for a potential pawn push on the king side, aiming to disrupt black's rather passive knight placement and open lines for attack. Bringing the monarch actively into the fray, the black king embarks on a daring central expedition, aiming to harness its newfound mobility to influence the isolated pawn structure and perhaps probe the weakened light squares around white's king. Shifting the bishop to the active c3 square anticipates potential pawn advances on the king side and prepares for central pressure, while also potentially freeing the d-file for rook activity should the opportunity arise. Targeting the weak squares around white's king, this bishop maneuver aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially create attacking chances on the queen side as the game simplifies. Controlling the central squares becomes paramount as the bishop retreats to a more defensive posture, surveying the landscape for opportunities. Black's bishop now embarks on a journey to g7, aiming to bolster the pawn chain and offer support to the beleaguered kingside pawns. The bishop relocates to a more active square, aiming to support the king's potential escape route and perhaps eye the queenside pawns later, a subtle repositioning in an otherwise static queenside exchange. Preparing to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Reclaiming the central square after black's last excursion with the bishop offers a better foundation for future operations, though it does concede a tempo for repositioning the king rather than immediately contesting the open file with a rook. The black king ventures out, seeking active participation in the endgame by aiming for the central squares, a bold maneuver that potentially overextends its defenses, but offers chances for dynamic play and counterpressure against white's slightly cramped position. Reactivating the knight to contest the d4 square and potentially support pawn advances on the queen side is a sensible decision, aiming to redistribute pieces and disrupt black's encroaching bishop. Asserting queenside dominion, black's king embarks on a daring journey, aiming to connect the past pawn potential and disrupt white's centralized influence. Challenging the bishop's position, the knight embarks on a daring sortie to the queenside, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's inherent weaknesses and potentially restrict black's piece mobility. Bidding for the light-squared diagonal, black aims to activate the bishop on c4, a piece that has been relatively passive since moving from d7. Opening the center with your pawn spearhead is a bold gamble, potentially creating diagonal lines for your pieces or leaving your own king exposed. Sacrificing the pawn to disrupt white's central structure and open lines for the queen feels like a desperate attempt to inject dynamism into a rather static position, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king. King centralization now becomes paramount as your monarch boldly steps into the fray, aiming to influence the central struggle and potentially support the advancing pawns. The black king, having ventured quite far from its starting square, now confronts a complex situation with white's pawns poised to advance and the bishop pair offering considerable pressure. The monarch ventures out from its protected corner, a bold sidestep aiming to reclaim central influence and perhaps discover some lurking weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The pawn push on b6 finally unblocks the bishop on c8, allowing it to potentially develop to a more active square and exert pressure on the d4 square, a critical central outpost. Activating the knight to a more aggressive outpost on a4 directly targets black's pawn structure and aims to exploit potential weaknesses on the queen side, a classic maneuver to gain initiative. Steering the bishop toward the exposed white king, seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and create attacking potential on the king side, is a logical continuation. This knight's repositioning aims to liberate the b-pawn and potentially create a protected passed pawn, a crucial endgame objective. Activating the monarch to challenge white's central pawn majority, forcing a reaction and potentially opening lines for the rook on the d-file. Reclaiming the central e4 square with the knight positions white to potentially support pawn advancements on the king side, or prepare for piece exchanges that simplify towards a favorable endgame. The knight's advance opens a crucial diagonal for the queen, preparing to challenge the enemy king's relatively exposed position by creating threats along the 8th rank. Unlocking the bishop's potential demands, reassessing the knight's dominion over this sector, aiming to reorient it towards a more impactful diagonal. The Black King's daring excursion to the center, after a lengthy maneuvering phase, now confronts a precarious existence, forcing White into a defensive posture to protect their pawn structure while simultaneously looking to exploit the exposed royal. Gaining space on the queen side, the knight's foray to c3 aims to exert pressure and potentially disrupt Black's coordination, forcing a reaction. The bishop retreats, a seemingly passive action, yet it redeems its earlier placement by eyeing potential infiltration squares on the queen side, a subtle attempt to unpick White's control over the b6 pawn and perhaps create a new avenue of attack should the knight on c3 be dislodged.